you are new to Perkins or new to administering these funds? Anybody? It's like a pretty good handful of you, so you guys make your grant a little bit riskier, right? And then results of federal monitoring, similar to the audit reports. So after the pass-through entity evaluates the risk, they're expected then to determine whether or not they need to impose specific conditions on the various subgrantees to mitigate that risk. Now this is a possibility under current rules. I don't know if you've ever heard of the high-risk designation and requiring specific conditions for high-risk grantees and subgrantees. That exists, but it happens very infrequently. In fact, I can think of only a half dozen high-risk designees that I know of in the whole U.S., right? Which is really small considering, all of our districts and subgrantees. Well, you should expect to see this evaluation of risk and the imposition of specific conditions to be a lot more prevalent, a lot more common under the new requirements and the new regulations. Because the expectation is that you look at risk and that you don't simply assign your risky subgrantees, but that you impose conditions on them that would mitigate that risk. And such conditions could be additional reporting, additional monitoring, technical assistance requirements, additional approvals, et cetera.
Well, one of the things, Bonnie, that I had asked Eric is how often does an entity have to be monitored? Coming from the program of student nutrition, the requirement was every LEA was put on a cycle, so every 3 years. That doesn't apply to the Perkins grantee. So how does an LEA fly under the radar to avoid?
Right. So the question is, how often do you have to monitor the subgrantees? And the answer is, it's not answered in the regulations. It just says that you have to monitor your subgrantees. It doesn't say annually. It doesn't say at least biannually, right? Every state has a different system as far as, sometimes everyone at least gets a desk audit, but then like a handful get an on-site audit. Sometimes it's a total cycle. Sometimes it's a combination cycle and risk assessment. So if you're higher risk, well, then you're going to go move up in the cycle, and right? So it's like a number of different ways, but there's no standardized, exact, precise formula that you have to use. Any other questions? I really do appreciate everyone sort of sticking with me here. I know we are just burning that candle. Monitoring has to include financial and programmatic reports. Corrective action has to happen. If you don't have corrective action, if there are repeat monitoring findings, it's an automatic internal control deficiency, and it's only going to sort of raise the stakes as far as the conditions that are imposed on you, and then also could lead to possible enforcement actions by the state. There should be a management decision on all of your single audit findings that the pass-through entity or the state would have to issue. Different types of monitoring tools are discussed, technical assistant on-site reviews, the arranging for agreed upon procedures that typically looks like an audit process. And then the enforcement actions, as I mentioned, if there is consistent noncompliance, if you're not making the corrective actions, if you continue to sort of butt heads with the state as far as what you think should be a finding or not a finding, well, there are processes, hearing, appeals, et cetera, that can take place. The state has the authority to withhold your payment, to disallow parts of your costs that have been expended, to suspend an award, to recommend a suspension and debarment, withhold other federal awards. So based on your noncompliance in Perkins, they could actually withhold your Title I funding or your IDEA funding or any other funding that comes your way. And then there's this like catch-all, any other remedy that may be legally available. So there's a lot of authority, a lot of power that states have to impose those corrective actions and correct the noncompliance. I will say, though, that for terminating an award, as well as withholding that exceeds 60 days and disapproving applications and some other things, there are hearing notice rights that are available for subgrantees, so you can dispute some of that stuff through a hearing process. A couple other new sections. We are coming into the digital age, and the regulations have been updated to say explicitly that all of the records, I mean, we know there's a lot of paper, right, in our Perkins grant. We have to keep a lot of paper. We have all that source documentation, documents all of those expenditures, et cetera. There is this option now to keep electronic records, right? Yeah. Yes. And I have no big buts for this one, so that's always good, right? I don't have any like, but you really can't. No, this is actually good news. You can do electronic records. If it's already electronic, if you have a system that already keeps electronic records, it's not like you have to print them out and then keep them in another file. Keeping them on the system is fine. If the record is originally in paper, right, if it wasn't generated electronically to begin with, but starts off as paper, that's fine too. You can scan it. Just make sure that it can't be altered, that it's still readable, et cetera, and that there's some controls in place for those purposes. But otherwise, absolutely can start keeping your records electronically. Just so you know, you should maintain your records for a minimum of 5 years. That's based on the statute of limitations, which basically says after 5 years, if you misexpended the funds, you're not liable for them. The statute of limitations only allows the Department of Ed or the state to go back to a 5-year period to collect on any misspent funds. So if, 6 years ago you went to Vegas with CTE, you're good. You're good. Yes.
So does the statute of limitations begin to run from when the violation occurred, or when it was known or discovered or should have been known?
So the question is, when does the statute of limitations begins to run? It actually begins running as of the date of the obligation of the funds that were considered misexpended. If it's of an issue where you just had funds that lapsed, that you drew down but never, there can be other issues then it can be either the point that they recognize, also if there's like journal vouchers involved and it was obligated here, but then it was changed to this, whatever. It can sometimes be the violation date, but generally speaking, it's that obligation date. Questions? Any other questions? Cost principles. So we just finished up really with our administrative requirements, the big three: financial management, equipment, procurement. I've been mentioning cost principles a little bit as we've gone through. You heard in your discussion on budget the importance of reasonable, necessary, allocable. Those are your cost principles. So cost principles are basically split up into two groups, right? You have your basic guidelines or basic cost principles. That's that every cost is reasonable, necessary, allocable to the award, that it's net of applicable credits, that's consistently treated. So if you have a policy on travel that applies to your non-federal funds, you would have to follow that same policy if you're traveling with your federal funds. It's not that, oh, well, we're going on Perkins, we can fly first class this time, right? It doesn't work that way. You got to be consistent. The other consistent treatment issue is if I classify costs as a direct cost versus an indirect cost, I need to be consistent in that classification across my different funding streams. Otherwise, you get into some double dipping issues, right? And you want to be consistent with GAAP principles, so general accepted accounting principles. And so those are your basic requirements: net of applicable credits, necessary, reasonable, allocable. I think I got them all. The big three, though: reasonable, necessary, and allocable. Reasonable goes to fair price. So when a cost is reasonable, it means that you got a good price for it. The language in the regulation says it's a prudent person standard. If somebody would make the same decision under the same circumstances, right? Necessary is really going to, is this needed for my program? Is this necessary for my plan? Have I identified a need in